In today's tutorial, we're going to be making some cool rock shockwaves with xparticles and Pyro, and it's going to be very similar to the Advection tutorial I did a couple of years ago, and that tutorial really blew up, and ever since then I have made these kind of shockwaves in dozens of projects. That being said, recently I was brought on to do a project for AMD for their new AI announcements, and this shockwave workflow was at the complete forefront of it and ended up becoming quite indispensable to the rest of the project. And it was a lot of fun to work on, so that's what I want to go over with a lot of this. Although we're just going to be focusing on the shockwaves and building them out and kind of the look dev and the look of that. There is going to be some separation to that tutorial from back then in terms of the method, but it's realistically going to be the look dev. There's a couple of changes that separate it, but that project was a ton of fun, and we did Pyro the whole time, so it was slow and it was laggy and the caches were huge, but it was a lot of fun and I enjoyed working with the people that I worked on that with. And as you can see from some of the images I've been flashing, we really took it quite far in some areas, but today we're just going to be doing the shockwaves. What I will do though is go and make a more in-depth tutorial on my Patreon with more of that crazy stuff because it's really slow and it's really difficult to deal with. But today we're just going to focus on the kind of shockwave and the look dev and see what kind of similar cool results we can get to what I did on this AMD project. So to begin, we will take an XP system, and there was some refinements I had to do compared to the shockwaves I'd made previously because there was some kind of holes in the process that we came across that we had to work around, and I discovered some amazing techniques in this project just from playing about. We're going to change the emitter shape to a torus. So you may remember a lot of this from the first tutorial if you did do that one. We're actually going to keep these parameters just as they are. We're going to change the emission to shot, and we'll bring this down to about 70. And we can crank up the speed a little bit, and we're going to want the radius pretty high, maybe something like 25. So if we give that a quick playthrough, we've got all these particles blasting out, and that's what we want. Particles blasting everywhere. Next up, we're gonna go to extensions and grab a Explosia FX source. And then we're gonna go to dynamics and we're gonna drop in a Explosia FX. And then what we want to do to see all the smoke is go to extended data and go to physical data and pop in some fuel. And then when we play through that, we're gonna get some pyro now. It's a little bit difficult to see. You can actually change the display type here to something like grid. Sometimes that can be a little bit better to see. Sometimes I prefer that. But actually back here in the physical data tag, let's give it some smoke and give it some fire as well. You can keep all these values probably around about 40 each. I feel like that works quite well. And then in this source tag, let's crank up the velocity to like 200. This is going to be quite important. And now we're getting a shockwave. Now let's just make a couple of tweaks to this before we add in our actual particles. So if we go to the Explosia FX and we go to simulation, let's turn off the gravity because you can see right now it's kind of like drooping down, right? We don't really want that. Kind of want it just going out on each plane. And that's going to be a bit of a cooler look. And then next up, we're going to go to the substeps, we're going to take the accuracy, we're going to crank the accuracy up. What that's going to do is help the smoke in the fire. I believe it kind of helps it stick to itself a bit more in the later frames, which is quite important, and that was something I really only came across for the first time in this project, as I was going really deep on pyro stuff. We'll change the adapt size to like 10, that's quite important, and that's this little blue box, and if your simulation starts to go too quickly, and it goes outside this blue box, you can actually see there that it's cutting off, and we don't want that. We want it to kind of race ahead so we can see the pyro, and it's still kind of cutting off there. One thing we can do on top of changing the adapt size is just changing the size of this big pink box as well, because this is our actual boundary, so it'll only go as far as that pink box. But the adapt size is still a little bit too low. I'll bring that up. And you just want to make sure that blue box gets away from the smoke and it doesn't really catch up. But the later frames of this, we did end up leveraging the later frames, and I'll go into that, but the later frames of these shockwaves always tend to fall apart, and that was when we were really trying to figure that out, is how do we get this to stabilize itself and look good in the later frames, because it has all this composure here, it looks good it looks tight, and then as you get to the later frames, and you'll see this more with the particles, it just starts to go a bit loopy and flaily, and you lose a lot of the advection, and the accuracy that we changed helps with that a whole lot. So what we can probably also do is I'll probably flicker this value back and forth a little bit, but change the voxel size, and this will just help with a little bit of detail, but it does slow things down. So we'll come back and forth with that. Probably leave it on like 5 for now, and then we'll bring it down when we've got our particles. You can see on 5, it just flies through the simulation. So what we want to do now is add in our particles to get shoved about by this pyro. So we can call this pyro, probably call this, I would want to call this pyro as well, so I'll probably call that pyro, but we'll call this pyro emitter just to separate it. And then we're gonna just create a new emitter. We'll call this particles. And with these ones, we're gonna make them a torus as well, but if you look at the boundaries, this torus is 25 and 50. Let's basically one up that, right? So let's do 50 and 75. So now it's just hugging and sitting on the outside of the pyro emitter. Let's turn off the pyro in the viewport, and then in the particles, let's go to emission. Let's change this to shot, and for now, let's set it to 100,000. Take off the speed. You don't want any speed at all. And then we're going to go to the pyro. We're going to go to advection. We're going to select advect particles, and pretty much leave this as it is. But what we want to do is go to the pyro emitter, go to modifiers, and then make sure that the pyro isn't affecting the particles that it's spawning off of. So you want to put it in here, make sure it's on this little blue circle, and then you can always put it in here and make sure it's on the orange tick for this one. And when you play through this now, you're going to get all these particles getting splashed about by the pyro emitter and this pyro. And this looks pretty good so far. And one thing we were really trying to concentrate on the project is this kind of billowing. Next up, let's go to the particles. Let's go to display. Let's change this to dots. And we can change the color mode to gradient parameter. Just leave it on age just now, just so the particles are kind of changing color a bit. This is pretty much the shockwaves we made in the first tutorial a couple of years ago. I think it was 2022 now. It doesn't feel that long ago. But you can see this is quite airy, and what we really want is to fill in this section in the middle. So the way we got around that was actually just keeping the particles on rate. This really, really helped things, and wasn't something I ever really considered, but it helps a lot. So now if we bring this up to, let's say, 500,000, well, we'll do 300,000 for now. And now we're getting a constant spawn of the particles. And they're going to consistently be affected. But there was another way we got around this as well. And if we change this back to shot now, and you really might want to go back and forth between these parameters to get the result you want, but let's actually change this to rate as well, and then set this value to about 70. And this also helped with the thickness, because if I keep this on shot for a second and we play through this, you know, this is the only smoke that we're going to get. And once that tapers off, we're not going to get any more. So late in the process, we actually ended up finding that leaving this on rate as well was netting some cool benefits, because then we were kind of getting these like trailing particles. So with both of them on rate, we're now kind of getting much more thickness going throughout. And you end up getting much more clouds and a lot more detail. But it kind of loses its shockwaveness, right? Because you're just firing all that smoke non-stop. I feel like it's better to keep this one on shot, but then keep this one on rate. And we're really only going to have the license for a certain amount of frames, but at least we're going to get more thickness this way than if we were to just keep it on shot. And then we bring it up to 800,000, and we're going to really start to see the effects of that. And now there's not really any gaps around the edges. But we're most likely still going to have that issue where, you know, in the later frames, it does start to taper off a little bit. And there is some ways around that. And one parameter I found that did help with that was this little setting here called the pressure. And the pressure seemed to really help with the particles kind of having a more even distribution, keeping the whole shockwave a little bit more neat in terms of where the particles are situated. And I was playing with this value quite a lot. And you can sort of just mess with it and go up and down. I can't quite remember exactly what it does, but I remember that it helped. So I do apologize for not being able to explain exactly what it's applying here, but I remember that it helped, and I remember that we used it. So even there as well, you can just see we're kind of getting this like web now. They're really, really sticking to it. Crank that up to 100, and you're just getting a much more thick shockwave. This just looks so much cooler than the ones that I had made a couple years ago in the tutorial. So as I did so much development on these shockwaves throughout this project, I thought, right, okay, I really need to come back and give some new insights on this, but also, you know, showing the new ends of Lookdev and creating a whole different look as well. Let's save the scene just now. And what was great about this setup is, you know, even in the actual scene files, we don't really do much else here. It's actually really, really simple. And I remember the first time I started trying like this kind of pyro explosion effect stuff, it was really scary. And just to see that, you know, we've just got a couple of emitters and some pyro, and we're not actually really going to add anything else in terms of xparticles, I think is really cool. Now, one of the issues we were also facing was the fact that we can see these particles spawning in. And with some shots, we had the logo on top, which covered that. But we also didn't want to use a scale modifier really, and that was because we didn't really want a hole in the middle. So I'm going to show you both solutions to this. Again, it's a little bit going back and forth. I did this in my first shockwave tutorial, is if we go and add a XP scale here, and we set this to particle radius, and we change this to set value, and we go to mapping, and we add some mapping, and we change this to radius value, and we have this scale in, something like this. Don't really want them to die off. We're not going to see this on the current display mode for the particles, so we would have to change this to something like circles. And what I'm going to do is just drop this count way down to 100,000 for a second. And you're going to see an issue. You're going to see the particles aren't advecting the same way, and that's because you would have to go to the modifiers and drag this XP scale into the emitter to make sure it's not affecting the pyro emitter, and then everything's going to be back to normal. And now the particles are scaling in, and it looks quite cool. And maybe want them a bit more sudden, and that gets around that issue if you wanted to do it that way. But like I said, we didn't really want a circle in the middle. So the way we got around that, let me just change this back to dots, was actually changing your emitter here. I'm just going to duplicate this just for the sake of the tutorial, because I'm probably not going to stick with this, but I just want to show you, and change this to a cylinder. And then let's rotate the cylinder up, and let's press F3 and squash it down. And now all these particles are going to spawn inside the cylinder, which is going to create that thickness. And then when you play through it now, you're going to get this constant emission coming out the middle. Of course, we would probably want that. The particle, it does look a little bit weaker here in a strange way. But, you know, if you crank those particles up, it's probably going to solve most of that. But then the issue was we were seeing the particles here spawning in over time. And our solution to that was actually it's a little bit confusing. I'm not going to go over it, but I will just explain it, is we would do Control-D and cache the simulation on like 90 frames per second. And then after we cache, bring the scene frames per second back down to 30. And that would almost cover it because they would be spawning in between the frames and you wouldn't really see it. So that was the way we kind of got around that. But if you want that thickness coming out in the middle, that's the way to go about it. I am just going to stick with this on Torus for now. So I'm going to delete that second emitter and do this. We're going to go for more of a shockwave. And yes, you still would see them spawning in here. That's where you would want the XP scale. I don't know if I'm going to use it or not, because I'm going to take more angles of like the edges. But nonetheless, hopefully you've got a kind of general understanding of the little things you can tweak right now to kind of get a couple of different results. The last thing we could do in this simulation here before we go to Octane is we could drop the voxel size. Like I said, this is going to make it slower, but you can have a look at the kind of detail you would get, whether you want that detail or not. Sometimes I thought it actually looked much better on the higher voxel size, but I believe this would also potentially add to the particles behaving a little bit better with the pyro, I would want to say. It's really up to you. I think I actually sat around 4 for the most part, somewhere in the middle. But sometimes the higher numbers do look good. And also you could do Control D and go to xparticles and just add some more subframes. I wouldn't go too high on this, but that could just help things look a little bit nicer as well. And I want to say that for now, that's pretty much our Shockwave. It looks pretty good. I was running a count of about 1 million for the most part with this. And now we have that. What we can do is go and do some Octane Lookdev. I would suggest probably caching this. I don't know whether we should do it now or do it at the end. Usually you can get pretty good Octane feedback without the cache, so I'm going to attempt to do that, and then maybe we can cache it at the end and slow the simulation down if we want to. But right now, I think I'm just going to attempt to work with it like this. The viewport doesn't seem too bad, so maybe we'll drop the count a tad if it does seem a bit too slow. But for now, I think this should be good for us to start setting up some renders. So we call this Shockwave, and we'll go into Octane. And the cool thing about these renders is we don't need anything. We don't need any textures. We don't need any models. We don't need anything. We can just do this straight off the bat. So let's go to the particles and let's add a Octane tag and make sure particle rendering is selected there. And we'll change this to geometry, and it should just spawn in a bunch of spheres. And we'll make sure this is on path tracing. And then let's drop in a cube. So if you've been watching my tutorials the last couple of days, you'll know I've been using cubes on these simulations. Little particle rule, cubes are going to look much better. So drag that way off to the side so we don't see it. Press Alt-G, and then let's duplicate it a bunch of times. And once you've duplicated it a few times, let's duplicate it again and again and again. And then put one at the end and call it big. And make it bigger than all the rest. And then select all of them, come to this Octane tag and drag them in there. Cool. And that's way too big. I don't know what's up with that. So maybe let's set them to 2. Maybe let's set them to 1. So clearly these cubes are just way too big. So as you can see, the cubes are, yeah, they're still way too big. So let's just like drop them all to like 0.3. And that's probably going to be a bit more of an appropriate size. And then we can have this one at like, I don't know, 0.7. And as you can see, it seems to be a common theme with me in my tutorials. I forgot to add particle rotation. So by default, I explained this the other day in my other tutorial in the Christmas calendar, because Cinema 4D's new particles also do this, and they don't add rotation by default to the particles. So you can see all of these cubes are facing the same direction right now, and this is to kind of speed it up a little bit and whatnot, but we can just add that rotation. So we'll come to the particles, hit use rotation, change it to random, and then enable simple spin, and set the spin amount to like something like 0.3 in all of them. And then we'll just play through that again, and now we're going to have that rotation. Cool, and you can't massively see it, but you can see that it doesn't look as weird as it did before. So now we can get into setting up some angles with this. I'm maybe going to make this one just a little bit bigger. And the first thing we're going to do is drop in a texture environment. Let's make it black, turn it off. And for the lighting here, I'm just going to drop in a camera first. Change it to 135, 0 out the X, 0 out the Z. All these, and actually want to set this to, I believe, -90, and then we can zoom out here and we're going to be above the Shockwave. I am just going to crank up that resolution, and then we can press F2, camera's perspective. I'm going to turn off my work plane again, and we'll drop in some lights from this angle, but Octane's still referencing that camera. So let's drop in a light and add a target it to the XP system, and let's just do one light over here. And we really want to recreate that look that I went for. These particles have gotten way too big again now, haven't they? So let's drop it down to like 0.5. It's probably better to wait till you've got some light set up to mess with the scale of things, because then you can actually see what's going on. So we'll do like one light at the side, and we'll make this kind of a bit more blue. Let's put it up there a little bit, and then let's grab another one and put it down this side. Make this one like orange. It's probably a little bit too much orange right now for my preference. So we're going to drag that a little bit further away, and we're going to drop it down so it's just hitting the back of the particles more when Octane decides to let me move stuff. There we go. Maybe a bit more. We'll come back to the lights. Let's go to the settings. Let's change this to like 512 just now. Slam all the depths to 8. And come to the GI clamp, set that to 10. And already we've got something pretty cool. But let's set up some materials. So let's drop in a universal material. Select the material, select all our cubes, right click the material, hit apply. And you can probably just put this one on the big cube as well just now. I forgot to mention as I was doing that, don't select the big one, but we'll put it on just now anyway. And then let's add a RGB spectrum, plug it in the albedo. Let's make it kind of like a dark blue. And maybe we want to take some of that color as well, but let's make it like a dark blue, you know, from the gradient parameter for the age. Make it a dark blue. Let's crank up the metallicness, and then let's crank up the roughness. Specular's good, and we can maybe just lighten it a little bit. And that's pretty good. We can duplicate this, put this one on the big one, and then in this material, what we're going to do is we're going to make it much shinier. So drop the roughness, you can drop the color a little bit too, because we want those to be our shiny particles. Up the metallicness a bit. And what I would also do is probably overcrank the IOR, just to really force the sparkles out of it. Having a bit of trouble seeing them right now, but they are there. They are moving about. We want more of those. So maybe we can see what this looks like on a slightly larger scale again. I can't remember if that 0.7 was like a bit too much. I'll have a little look. This does seem to be okay, but there could be too many small ones, so maybe delete some of them out. See how that looks. The other solution to this, which we can do in xparticles, which I couldn't do in my tutorial the other day, was we can, let's delete more out. Let's kind of get in there now. Maybe delete another 4. We can create a second emitter that's just for big particles and do it that way. But I think for now this looks good, so we can just pull the size down a little bit again. And let's come back to the lights, and now we've added these like dark materials, the lights are not covering as much. So we'll bring this light up a bit. Down a bit, that's too much. The look of this was to be very kind of shadowy and, you know, dark in some ways. And the material is probably a bit too of a funky blue, so we can darken it a tad. And probably drop the roughness as well, actually. That'll just help with some of those sparkles. And I'm quite liking this just now. So let's set up the camera imager. Let's enable the camera imager. I'm gonna, first of all, put my LUT in there. And then add highlight compression, and we're gonna mess with these values. So you can see we're getting somewhere with it. It's looking a bit too sharp right now. We'll add some vignetting. And for now, this should look good. You can always just use ACES tone mapping as well if you want to. It's going to get you a pretty similar result, for example. But you have to remember, highlight compression won't work, gamma won't work. None of that really matters in this region here. But we shouldn't have to put the exposure up that much. Maybe we can give that some more roughness again. Something like that. It's a little bit nicer. And now this is looking quite good. Let's add a fillet to all the cubes. So let's set this to like 0.1, and that's going to make the light hit them all a bit softer and make them all look a little bit nicer. It's really going to help with the color and the whole kind of tone of everything, actually. Looks much nicer. And with that, we can maybe increase the size of these up to 1 and see if that gets them moving a bit more. So that's clearly way too big. Makes it look like it did before. Maybe we increase the size of the fillet for these ones. And I'm having to kind of jog my memory as I go here to get these to, let's do 0.6. Seems sparkly enough for the most part. But a second ago, it looked much nicer. So let's do 0.5. There's probably, probably too many of them. Let's duplicate all these, duplicate them all again. And then a quick way to get around this is basically just delete all of these out of there. I mean, I would maybe pause Octane. Just so you don't have to like count anything up, it's just delete them all out and then drag them back in again when you're doing that. Just makes it a little bit easier than like trying to remember which one's which. And then maybe now I can make it a bit bigger without it taking over the entire look of everything. I did not think I'd be spending this much time messing with the scale of the cubes. It's maybe a little bit better. Okay, cool. That's looking quite good. Maybe we'll mess with some things a little bit at the end and come back to some of these little nooks and crannies. So I'm going to come off Ace's tone mapping for a second, and we're just going to play with that. We'll come to post-processing and crank up the bloom a little bit. Give it a bit more saturation, a bit more vignetting. Right now I think this looks quite cool. So let's set up some different cameras, get some of those cool close-ups going, and then maybe mess with the look dev a little bit again at the end. But one thing that was really adding to the look for this for me as well was motion blur. You have to be careful because it can crash your Octane really, really easily. If you set this to 0.008 and we pause Octane and we play through this, getting the motion blur on the simulation was really adding a lot. It added so much to the point that the renders didn't feel as good without them. So motion blur can really help with these, but man, it can crash your stuff so much. So hopefully, yeah, you see your renders in there. Just looks so cool with the motion blur. But we'll come back to that. We'll mess with it a little bit more on the close-ups and stuff. But I found that really, really added a lot. And you can maybe make this not so orange. Maybe a little bit too orange. You can probably make this light a little bit more blue. This is just recreating the look that we went for, but maybe not that much. And in quite a few versions as well, I did mess with the kind of like making the actual particles, like the shockwave, much more blue. But we can play with all that throughout things. I think it does look cool, quite blue actually. So yeah, without me getting sidetracked, let's go and set up some different cameras, and then we'll come back to the look dev after. Okay, so let's set up a couple of different cameras. I'm going to turn off motion blur for now, just because it can have a tendency to crash. And it seemed okay for the most part. Sometimes it seemed to play up a little bit more after I'd cached, which is a little bit strange. We're just going to duplicate the camera and we'll turn them off, and you're just going to want to zoom in here and find a cool angle. I'm going to up the focal length to like 300 for these ones. And we can spin around here. Just find a nice little angle. And what you're going to immediately notice is it doesn't look very good. And that's because what we need to do is hit this little focus tool and focus somewhere on the shockwave. Come to the camera imager, go to your thin lens, go to depth of field, crank this way up to like 45. Change your aspect ratio to 2, your edge to 3, and change the roundness to like 0.1. And you can see now we're getting something that looks really cool. And this was kind of the staple of these shots, was this massive depth of field. That's what we wanted to go for, with this big bokeh on the lens. And we can have a little spin here, see what we can find. And you really just got to like move the camera about, get lucky, you know. That's what's good about how quick this feedback is that it makes it entirely possible to do this. Just change the focal length as we're going. So this one looks quite cool. I like that a lot. One thing that is going to help this though is probably the particle size. So we will adjust that in a second. And let's see what's going on over here. I really like this angle. Looks very cool. Maybe want to get in a bit closer actually. That looks awesome. Absolutely awesome. Yeah, just keep duplicating the cameras, just keep moving it about till you get something that looks pretty darn epic. One of the shots that I really enjoyed going for was like these kind of half cut zooms on the shockwave. So it'd be kind of something around here. And then on that shot, I would maybe like up this even more to something like 75. Maybe rotate that a little bit. something like that. It just looks absolutely awesome. But like I mentioned, let's have a little look at the particle size. So I feel like it's probably a little bit too big. So if we change, let's take half of these and put them in a group. Because we're in Octane, it doesn't matter that we group them here. And let's change half of them to 0.15. And then let's change the other half to like 0.05. So go really small. And you might like the kind of thicker particles, but I feel like making them really, really small is going to benefit, especially when we come back out to that wide angle. It just helps, especially the sparkly ones, it helps them pop quite a bit more. Just check some of the other angles here too. And don't forget to save. So yeah, this is looking really cool. I really like that. Maybe just try one more camera angle somewhere on this side. Cool. Not a whole lot else to change here. I'm going to show you a couple more tricks that I did to make this look good. What we should do as well is just check this top angle. And you can see now with that particle size adjusted, that looks quite a little bit better. It's popping a lot more, a bit more contrast. And we can mess with the camera imager here too. But if we come back in the material, I made us take that gradient parameter. And that can be really useful because we can now grab an instance color, drag the particles emitter in there, and drag that in the albedo, and it's going to give us a bunch of color. So what we can do is put a gradient on that, and we're just going to kind of mimic the colors that we used on the RGB spectrum, like a dark blue. And then I did do this on some of the shots that I rendered out when I was working on this project, is kind of put like a bit of an orange on the edges. That can really boost things. So you just want to really tighten these up, because we didn't adjust this gradient here. And like I mentioned in my tutorial the other day as well, is this gradient is just feeding off this. So if we were to change this, we'd have to play through it again, but we're having to kind of leverage on the values of that a little bit. But we can still clip it and just get that kind of orange on the sides. And then if we come back to the other angles now, you're going to see that looks really cool. Kind of got that nice orange just poking through on the sides. That certainly adds a lot. And the last thing is actually adding a little bit of fog. So if you recall that, rename that Octane Sky to like background, and we duplicate it. And the reason we're duplicating it is just if we want to switch back and forth between the two. And we call this one, just call it ENV for like environment. And go to the medium and add a fog. And you can make this whatever color you want. Orange looks cool here. I made them blue on my renders. And then we're just going to increase the medium radius back here to about 15. And then drop the density. And this is going to kind of vary shot to shot. So you kind of have to get used to adjusting it. And then you can mess with the phase a little bit. You can see what the phase does here. Kind of like moves it closer to the light if you want that kind of effect. But what I would go for is just this kind of like haze over the image. It just kind of makes everything a bit more cohesive, makes it all blend together nicer, makes the shot look more professional too. But I didn't use it on all the renders, and you can see that in some of these shots it's going to completely blast itself through the roof. So generally I would go for a smaller value in the density and then make up for that with the phase. And then any of these cameras that are going to be closer to the light are going to, well, either of the lights really are going to be impacted more. And then I would just mess with the cameras individually and find something that looks good. And I would maybe put a little bit more blue in the material. I believe that is what I did do, is just put a little bit more blue in there. Not super happy with this camera angle. And that was the last one I did as well. Make it more something like this. Again, not still super happy with that. That's looking a bit better. The particles are maybe a bit too small in that region. Let's move it about, see what we can find. See, now that I like. Especially that. That's kind of the shots we're going for. And on the top angle, I would actually just duplicate it again because it's going to look so different up here that I would often end up flicking with these values a lot. And I would just sort of, when I'm look deving like this, I would just sort of change it and then crash out a render quickly. Because I would just be messing about just to kind of see how we can push this and develop it. And, you know, just get something like that, like a nice little haze over the top of the image. And you can see there, it's just absolutely crazy, but we'd want to switch back to the other one. I think this is my favorite though. And this is my absolute favorite. So yeah, if you're going to render out a couple shots of this, or you're going to render out animations, I would just be prepared to kind of mess with this fog depending on what camera you're working with. And aside from that, I don't think there's much else to go over. That's pretty much it. That's kind of what I wanted to cover today, was maybe zoom that in a little bit more. Even just make I tend to do this, I just duplicate all the time, because then if I'm kind of go in a direction I don't like, I can just straight away go back. But you can see just moving that camera closer has affected the amount of haze we've got on the image as well. That looks pretty cool. Yeah, honestly, that's pretty much it. That's kind of what I wanted to go over and just do these shockwaves today. That was absolutely nuts. I'm not going to keep affecting it for every camera angle. So yeah, all I really wanted to go over today was this kind of base shockwave. As you saw from the images I flashed at the beginning of the tutorial, I'll flash them again now as well, is during the process of this, we went through a bunch of different look dev stages, and we really started out with this shockwave and focusing on building the kind of billows and getting that shape and understanding what values pushed that. And then we went into more complex scenes, which included making it much larger, having it bounce off the edges of a box, and then also having it advect a bed of particles. So you've got the shockwave on top of a bed of particles. You'd have like 3 million particles, and it was really slow. I'm going to go over that stuff on my Patreon. So that'll be out in a couple of days after I put this on YouTube. So make sure you go and check that out, and we're going to just kind of dive much deeper into the rabbit holes of that stuff. But for today, I really just wanted to keep this to the shockwaves and some of the earlier stages of look dev that were a bit more simple and not really going into the realms of it being absolutely too mental. The one thing we can finish off here with is getting our motion blur back on, but we do want to tread very lightly with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it, turn on the motion blur, I'm going to play back through it and come up to frame 21, 22-ish, and hopefully this should not crash. So you can see with the motion blur, that just absolutely brings it to life in a whole nother way. That's actually probably a bit too much motion blur, but I really feel like this brings it to life, and we can just grab all these cameras here and turn it on all of them, and then we'd maybe just want to wait for that to catch up. And if we flick through these, hopefully we should get some cool looking motion blur, as you can see there as well. So let's check that favorite angle that I liked, the top one, wherever that one was. That one's cool again. We can just mess with the camera here. That looks absolutely awesome. It's crazy you can get this in such a, days and days of work the first time I made this, to just do it in an hour-long tutorial. Let's let this catch up. Really not going to try and stress Octane out with too many inputs while I'm waiting with motion blur. Yeah, that looks crazy. Absolutely nuts. I think that one there was probably my favorite with the motion blur. So yeah, the motion blur, just like the depth of field, you combine the depth of field with the motion blur, and it just, you don't even have a render before that. It doesn't even look good until you do that, at least in these close-ups, So pretty much going to leave that there. Just wait for this to catch up for a second. I'm going to leave you on this shot here. Hopefully you've learned a lot. I know I made this shockwave tutorial a couple of years ago now, but The Lookdev is really what spins this in a whole different direction, and just kind of learning a couple different angles and what we can do to make it look really, really cool, and adding a couple more things in the simulation that just make it quite a bit better. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and there'll be another tutorial coming out tomorrow. There'll be more stuff from this AMD project coming out as well. Make sure you go to the Patreon and be on the lookout for the more complex versions of this. If you like this style that we used on this project and you like the way the scenes are built, then we're just going to go crazy on that. So be on the lookout for that, and thank you for staying to the end. I do appreciate it. Hopefully you've got a cool render set in front of you, just like I do. And I will see you tomorrow for another Christmas calendar tutorial. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube. Things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm. Breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.